Hi, I'm Diane McGarry with Drake Arts. With me today are co-host Tom McGarry, artist Robin Edward Trudel, and ASL interpreter Connie. Robin got his start in woodworking when a coworker gave him a carving knife and encouraged him to carve a mushroom. Shortly after completing his first piece, he discovered and joined the New England Woodcarvers. His boundless enthusiasm soon found him volunteering for the organization and eventually serving as president for 3 years. Robin was a contributing author to Carving magazine and was invited to write an article on carving to children. The result caught the eye of Publishing, who has helped Robin to develop books on wood carving, especially for children. And I have to say, my kids and I have used them and they're great.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Robin's Pine Tree Studios is nestled among the hills and forests of northern Massachusetts. The lumber mill still supplies the locally sawn wood for most projects, and it's only a few minutes away to New Hampshire. Walking among tree trunks and fresh sawn lumber provides inspiration for uniquely sculpted pieces. He is the author of Carving for Children, An Introduction to Carving, Schnitzen für Kinder, Easy Carving Projects for Children, and most recently, Let's Carve, which was published in late 2021, and they're all available on our bookshop, actually. Robin, I met you years ago when I was homeschooling my children, and you were teaching a bunch of kids how to carve, and you were so good with them. You had so
You're
much,
very kind. Thank you.
well, you were. You had so much patience and enthusiasm for them, especially when they goofed off like my son did. And we're just very grateful that the co-worker gave you a carving knife because, oh my gosh, it's been incredible since then, hasn't it?
It has been quite a journey. Just before our call, actually last night, I once again tried to relocate that woodcarver, the woodcarver who got me started. Um, and about 10 years ago, he just seems to have fallen off the map.
Mm, that happens sometimes.
He was, well, it's been 30 something years, and he was in his early 60s then, so perhaps he's not with us anymore.
Well, maybe he's carving in the sky.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So tell us about your favorite things to carve and the different tools that you use. It's not just a knife, right? You use more than that.
So the tools vary from project to project. When I'm doing, I probably should have did this before the call, but when I'm working on smaller pieces, then I'm mostly working with a single-bladed fixed blade knife, sometimes gouges and chisels with a mushroom-shaped handle, which is sort of round. And that would be exclusively what I work on pieces that I can hold in one hand and carve with the other. Relief work, such as some of the pieces that you've seen hanging behind me, and pieces like this, I'd be working with mallet-driven tools. So like a full-size wood carving tool, and then be driving with a mallet. This particular piece is in cherry, and the finish that I wanted the dress to appear smooth, so it was sanded. It's unusual for me to sand carvings, but usually I like to leave that chiseled, tooled finish. But in that
Sure.
particular carving, it had to be sanded to get the look I wanted to achieve.
So you've done them with all your grandchildren, like you were saying before we started recording. Behind you are two of your grandchildren, and then you have more of them up there. But
Yes.
those,
So this is a relief piece from Eastern White Pine. You can see the sort of rough finish.
uh-huh.
Uh, and this side was as provided by the lumber mill up the street. And it's finished with just acrylic paints. I left, and I usually do this for skin color when appropriate. I'll leave the natural color of the wood.
Oh, okay. So what types of wood do you like? Could you just mentioned cherry? I know pine is very easy to work with, but almost too easy, right? Because it carves so fast.
Yeah, yes, I'm working on some Christmas ornaments this year made from pine, and I've laminated thin pieces, but turned the grain 90 degrees so that the thin members are supported a little bit. But pine is it's very abundant in New England,
Right.
and it's usually fairly easy to get your hands on. The carvings do have to be designed to the strengths of pine. Thin members, very delicate pieces, if they aren't supported, will break off in the process. Um, but one of the things that I like about it is I can get it in virtually any size or dimension, just driving up the street. Another source that I use for carving. So my sons and I teach Olympic Taekwondo at the Greater Lowell YMCA. My grandmaster was out of the country during COVID and closed his studio and actually retired from teaching. So, without getting too deeply into that, part of the curriculum requirements for Taekwondo is board breaking. So we recycle all the pine boards that the students break, whether in demonstrations or testing or whatever, and I'll laminate those together to make other carvings. I can get some examples, but that means going off camera.
Do you ever laminate 2 or more different kinds of wood?
So the carving I just showed you is get 2 pieces. I don't know that I've got anything at hand. I do occasionally. I know that there are folks that like to do the cutting boards with black walnut and maple and stack the things. Most of the time when I'm laminating, it's to contrast a darker wood and a lighter wood, but not necessarily. So it's to contrast the finished piece with the base it's mounted on.
Yep.
That must be hard if you've got different hardnesses of wood together to carve them.
Well, wood, as is obvious, wood's a natural material.
Yeah.
Certainly there's density difference between different species, but there's density difference between different trees, and in some cases different parts of the same tree. My one piece of wood wisdom that I think is unique that I've contributed to the body of knowledge on wood is that a tree is not concentric cylinders, it's concentric cones.
Oh.
Talk about that more.
So a tree is a cone rather than a cylinder because it meets the top. If you think of a sapling, the top of it is sort of a point. And each growth ring adds another concentric cone onto the tree.
Of course. Oh my gosh, but when you think of it that way.
So with that knowledge, if you pick up a board and you cut into it, I can tell you whether it's a branch or the trunk, which direction the tree grew in. Because if you are cutting from the base of the tree or branch out towards the top of the tree or the end of the branch, you're cutting with the grain. If you're cutting in the opposite direction and it breaks, then you're cutting down the tree or down the branch towards the trunk.
Oh. So someone could actually give you a whole bunch of logs and you could put it together like a puzzle to make the tree again.
You really could.
Oh my God.
And you can the other fun thing about it is that I can pick up a piece of like random scrap wood and with one knife cut tell you which ends up, which one's down from the tree's perspective.
Wow.
Now, having said that, trees are living beings and branches change grain direction. Hard, dry summers, windstorms, all these things have an impact on how a tree grows. One of the reasons that many woodworkers get frustrated when they want to use the old school tools is that those old school, meaning more than 100 years ago, tools were designed to work with old growth forests where trees were left alone in stands for hundreds of years and the grain is very, very straight and clean. So all the edge tools do very well turning those logs into boards. However, virtually all of New England has been clear cut at one time or another. So most lumber trees that you're going to get that are local generally are less than 50 years old. So the grain, so that's why woodworking has developed to machine wood
Mhm.
rather than cut wood, because the grain goes so wonky.
The grain goes wonky?
So if a tree grows straight
Yes,
and those concentric cones are in a straight line, then if you put a edge tool in, you'll get a clean split.
right.
If the tree has grown and twisted, if you try and put an edge tool in here, you're going to get unexpected results.
So why are the younger trees more twisted than the older wood was?
So the older wood would have been, or let me rephrase, it's not necessarily the age, but the older trees, the trees that lasted longer, the 100-year-old trees, would have been selected for
As opposed to
woodworking.
clear cutting.
And then, so yeah, when they were clear cut, the straightest would have been selected for woodworking. And anything with a twist or whatever would have been put aside as firewood
Oh.
or turned into ply for ornamental work,
Okay.
because those twists can sometimes be attractive.
Mm.
Now we don't have any old growth wood, so all trees are used indiscriminately.
Mm.
I'm making a generalization. I can go to a lumber mill and say, I want this board or I want that board. And sometimes I can get some really glorious pieces of wood. For example, this is a single piece of cherry. This will be used for, and you can see the growth rings there. This is going to be used as part, it will be auctioned off as a charcuterie board to raise funds for a historic church in Nashua. So this is one glorious piece of wood. You can see the grain's very, very straight, but that's because I hand selected it. If you were to go into Home Depot, even if they have cherry, or some other mill where they have cherry wood, you'd find the grade is kind of wonky and could easily be machined for mill work or whatever, but carving it or splitting it would be very difficult.
I've heard there have also been genetic engineering in trees, so they grow faster, so they're not as strong. The wood isn't as strong. Is that true?
So the only genetic engineering that or fiddling that I've heard is to try and bring back the American chestnut, which has been not particularly successful. They found a stand of chestnut in Maine, I believe. And this is literally the past few months.
Oh, wow.
That hasn't succumbed to, I think it's a fungus. But there was a disease. So in one of the reasons that the United States survived is those early winters, the early citizens fed themselves from American chestnuts. Unfortunately, in the early part of the 1900s, there was some disease that killed off most of the American chestnuts. It had a devastating effect on mammals in North America. But the chestnut was glorious furniture and carving wood. And right now, the only source to carve it is from disassembling old furniture. Now, there's horse chestnut, which the nuts have too much something in it that's not great for humans to eat. And it's a little bit more coarse to carve. I've tried it, I didn't like it. But that's the only genetic the engineering of tree species I'm very familiar with. The good news is pine trees just grow and they're everywhere and they grow quickly. But even in the species themselves, there's very much variation depending on whether they're in sandy soil or they're in loamy soil. There's some pieces of pine that are just glorious to cut into and feel like almost like you're carving soap. There's pines that grow higher up on an elevation where they're drier, and the difference between the dry, harder wood and the winter, softer wood is much greater, and it makes it very difficult to carve.
That's
Difficult to carve, not necessarily from the amount of force needed to carve it, but difficult because the growth rings respond differently and they need different angles, so it's just no fun to work with.
So you have to adjust your carving around the growth rings of the wood that you're working with.
Oh, absolutely. I have a bigger example here. This, I'm very, very happy with how it came out. I don't know how much I'll fit on camera here, but
I like the facial expression.
thank you. As fun as this came out, this is perhaps the most miserable piece of wood I've worked on
Really?
in 20 years. This tree must have been twisted and turned over and kicked around and just melt. The elements were not kind to this tree.
Mm.
And the direction of the grain, especially. So in this little corner,
Mm.
the grain changed literally in 6 different directions,
Mm.
Oh
just
my
in this
God.
3-inch space. And there's no knots.
Wow.
Oh, actually, here's a good. I don't know if you can quite see these checks back here.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
the pith of the tree goes through here, so that's probably part of it.
Mm.
Or perhaps it was a branch coming off. I don't remember. I haven't. This piece is a couple of years old, but what a what a miserable amount of work to try and figure out. So it required switching tools inch by inch,
Oh no.
and in some cases, selecting tools that had a flatter bevel.
Mm.
So the angle of the sharpening tool, I wish I had a better way to illustrate it. There's a whiteboard behind me, but I can't see it.
Mm.
You probably can't see it. So the angle of the edge of the sharpening tool for pine was generally 22.5 degrees, which is easy to eyeball because it's half of 45.
Right, right.
Or most carving tools are 22.5. Pine is usually a little bit thinner.
Mm.
But with the growth rings giving me a fight, I had to go with something steeper.
Oh.
So most of my tools they're tuned to work in pine and pine and walnut and basswood and things like that. But I've got some steeper tools that I kind of keep to the side for when I need them. And I was constantly going back and forth. It was maddening. And it's not even I was doing anything particularly intricate. I was just trying to achieve a flat surface.
If that piece of wood was so miserable to work with, why did you pick it? Or how did that happen?
I am nothing if not persistent.
Okay.
I have pieces that I've struggled with for 8 years just because I wasn't going to let it beat me.
Okay.
I have another piece not far off screen where I had the idea to do a 1/3 size carousel, an armored carousel horse unicorn.
Oh, nice.
And I decided to give it scale armor. So these are little kind of like fish scales that
Yeah.
are over
Yeah.
each other. Seemed like a great idea at the time.
Oh.
Carving each one of them individually was not a party.
Mm. Mm.
And I only recently, actually, I think this year I finished it, having started 8 years ago, thinking it would be a weekend project. It was exhibited at the Arts Gallery of Lowell a couple of months ago, over the summer at least.
Congratulations, I think.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, these projects then teach you something too, right? Not just about the wood, but about your own process and your own ideas.
And yeah, there's a lot to learn at the end of a wood carving tool, both about myself, about the materials, and where I am in the sort of the greater scheme of things, right? My wood carving mentor, Paul Ward, recently passed away. And he lived a long, full life. He was a Marine. He raised 4 children and grandkids, and he contributed poetry and statuary, both of which are distributed all over the world. So he lived a long, full life. Of course, huge gaping hole in my life when he passed. And his family asked me to help break down his workshop, essentially, so they could sell the home. And playing a part in tearing down a wood carving studio that has produced liturgical statuary for over 50 years by a person that was very, very close to me, at least as close as any family member. I had a lot of thoughts. And one of the things that I've taken to reminding other people who create is to sign and date everything.
Oh.
Sign and date everything. Because if something has got some kind of signature and date on it, at the point at which it goes out of the hands of people who knew who made it,
Mm,
if it's got a date and a signature, then it's more likely to be retained.
mm,
Yeah.
In addition to the historical value of having something with a date and a signature on it. And I had, until that point, I had just been making stuff, and then sort of realizing, um, going through just how much stuff of his that I needed to help them dispose of,
Mm.
both in the literal terms of what went in the dumpster and then what was to be preserved and what had value and what didn't, has changed how I think about what I'm doing.
oh,
One of the reasons I spoke a little earlier about creating Christmas ornaments. One of the reasons I got into creating an annual Christmas ornament is because Paul and I had exchanged ornaments for about 30 years.
oh, wow.
And I've got a little dedicated Christmas tree with has just the ornaments that Paul had given me.
Mm,
And it was always fun. We developed over the 30 years a tradition that I would show up at his house on Christmas Eve, and we would have a little catch up and swap ornaments. And it was just very cool to see things I had made 30 years ago on somebody else's Christmas tree.
huh,
I bet.
And hearing how Paul's family were contending to get ornaments, and knowing, and I had been at the same time period giving them to my family, I decided to get a lot more diligent about making sure I signed everything, because who knows where these things end up.
yeah.
And deciding on what I'm carving, one of the lessons that came to me very, very quickly after he passed is that not everything has to be epic.
Hmm.
And I had gotten to this sort of
Yeah.
egoist moment where I wasn't going to do something unless it was dramatic. And not too long after, and I'm going off camera for a second, there was an item that was in the stuff that the family was discarding for Paul, and it was a little tiny giraffe blank. And blank is the step between board and starting to carve, where you draw an outline onto the board and rough out the material, both to reduce labor and to reduce waste. And I had kind of stalled after those events had settled down, helping him break things down. And I picked up this little tiny carving and just started working on it.
Oh, wow.
And in about an hour or so, I finished it.
Hmm.
And this is never going to be in a museum. Nobody's ever going to pay anything for this.
Hmm.
But the amount of joy that it's just randomly brought to people,
Hmm.
it just reminded me that not everything has to be epic. Not everything has to be sketched and reproduced in clay. And then not everything has to have this big dramatic theme. And it's helped me sort of get back to my roots, where before I'd go into my workshop and be working on these multi-session projects and kind of get bogged down in them sometimes, where I can just go downstairs, pick up a piece of wood, pick up a knife, make a thing.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Ever work on really big things? And if so, what do you use? Chainsaws or something else?
So I've done some chainsaw pieces. That big piece that I showed you was roughed out with a chainsaw.
Ah.
When I'm working on what I'd call heroic size statuary, which isn't classically heroic. Classically heroic is like anything over 10 feet or something like that. But what I'm calling heroic in terms of what my workshop can process, I will use chainsaws and axes to get to a certain point. There's a company in Australia called Arbortech, and I had the privilege, when they were starting to explore the American market, the U.S. market, they had contacted New England woodcarvers, and we did conversations. So they sent a representative, literally halfway around the planet, to show us the tools, and I acquired several of them. So it's essentially, so you take an angle grinder, you remove the angle grinder wheel, and then one of the tools was a steel wheel with little carbon
Mhm.
tungsten circles.
Uh,
And these teeth could go through the wood. And it's absurd. It's like 250,000 times a minute or something.
Wow.
It's not so, it's you feel like you're taking an eraser to the wood and it's vanishing.
Huh.
The tools come with many, many instructions, safety instructions, and safety devices to keep you from carving yourself, as it were. So I'll process from a log, chainsaw, axes, or something called a fro, and split some bits off. Then process to the Arbortech tools to do some further shaping. But essentially, once it gets small enough that I can get it in my workshop and chuck it up in one of the holding devices, then it's the mallet and the full-size gouges and chisels.
Wow.
Was
Thank
it hard to learn the arbor, whatever it was, tool, the dangerous to use tool?
So let me clarify. The Arbortech tools are not necessarily they're not dangerous. There are things on the market that you put an angle grinder and you're taking your life in your own hands. Arbortech, in order to meet ISO standards in Europe, was very, very careful for making sure that you can't say idiot proof, right? But make it very, very easy to use the tool in a safe
Okay.
manner. There we go. That's what I'll say.
Yeah, that's
I was,
great.
as I said, very fortunate that I had an opportunity to meet them firsthand so that they could literally show me this is what works and this is what doesn't work. So I did a lot less experimenting. I've learned a few things and some techniques since then, but I was very fortunate to be able to learn from them.
Cool.
That's great. That's great. I hate to cut you off on this, but we do have to do that. To see more of Robin's work, please join us at his art gallery during our March Art Saturday. Register at Eventbrite. You can also purchase his books at our bookstore. This is bookshop.org/shop/Drake Arts. We'd like to thank all our sponsors for making these programs possible. If you'd like to become a sponsor, please go to drakearts.com/donate. Donate, not donut. Oh, goodness. For more information about our Art Saturdays and other programs, please visit our website, that's drakearts.com, or email us at drakearts@gmail.com. This and all our programs are archived on the Drake Arts YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/@drakearts. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.